Hi, in this video we're going to be going over how to hold start and end frames for maintaining poses inside of Sequencer for Unreal Engine. To get started, make sure you have the mannequin pack installed, and if you look inside your mannequin pack from Fab, you should see some animations, and we're only going to be specifically using the run forward animation that's named Run Forward. If we take a look at the details for this animation, we'll see that it is in fact 30 frames per second at the frame rate, and it has 57 frames of animation inside of it. And to get started, we will jump into the engine and we'll have a basic setup that looks something like this, where we have a sequencer and we have the 57 frames of animation plopped in, and we have the handle set at 0 and 57 frames. All right, so with this here setup, we'll notice a few things in the basic defaults is that when we scrub outside of the range, you'll see that Manny goes back to the bind pose. And this is the default behavior. And if you want to actually preserve the pose from the last frame, there are a few techniques built in. And so we'll take a look at one of the ones that are suggested, and we'll see where it kind of falls apart. So one technique that is commonly used is this keep state inside of properties. So when we set this to keep state, it's great now that we have the ability to scrub, and then when we finish the last frame, you can see that the pose is preserved. However, if we are going frame by frame and scrubbing slowly, and we jump directly from a frame to an area outside afterwards, you'll see that the pose doesn't actually update. So if we click it, you can see that it stays at the pose from the previous frame. And the reason because this is that it's evaluating the frame by frame, and when it leaves this section, it's actually just preserving the last frame it evaluated. So this isn't ideal if you're rendering and you have a bunch of animation clips, and if let's say you set your render to start here, but you're expecting a character to be in its final pose. And then with this setup, you won't have the final pose, and you might just have it in the T pose or the bind pose. So if we take a look back at our notes, you can see that we have set the when finished to the keep state. But rather than setting this up over and over again, if you do want to use this technique, you can go into your default engine INI settings inside of config default engine INI, and you can add this little snippet here into your INI file. And once you restart engine, by default, if you have your AnimSequence section set to project default, it will be utilizing the keep state rule. So as we mentioned, this works in some cases, but it only works if you're single frame stepping through the entire animation clip. Another commonly used technique that you might see online or being taught is this pre-roll, post-roll frame technique, and we'll show where it's good and where some cases where it's not great. So coming back into the engine, we'll open our pre-roll example. And you can see here we have the same clip, and we have set it just with a pre-roll to negative or 100 frames for the pre-roll and 100 frames for the post-roll. And you can tell that there's a pre-roll because there's these white arrows before and afterwards. So from here, we're just going to resize our clip really quick. And you can see that as we scrub, you'll see that the pre-roll is in fact triggering, and it's playing the frames before, and the post-roll is in fact playing the frames afterwards. Although this is somewhat okay, we often want the case where we actually want to preserve the pose. So let's say we want everything before frame 15 to look like this pose rather than playing the frames before the animation. And likewise, you want to have this pose, the final pose on frame 37 here, to hold and persist across this whole range rather than having this post roll. So by default right now, there's no mechanism for you to pause the pre-roll to stop at the specific frame, or to stop the playback of the post-roll to hold the pose. So unless you're working with a setup where you don't have this first loop start frame, and you set that to 0, for example, then you won't be able to leverage the hold pose correctly. So with the first loop start frame offset set to 0 here, the pre-roll does do what we intended for it to do, but the post-roll still doesn't work well in holding the pose. So if you are using an offset frame, you might want to take a look at some of the other techniques that we'll be proposing in this video. All right, so just to reiterate, we did take a look at using the pre-roll and post-roll frame technique, but when we have first loop start frame offset set to offset the frame, it doesn't really hold that well for the pre-roll or the post-roll. All right, so what can we do instead? One of the approaches that we've come up with that we commonly use is to duplicate the section that you have and change the playback parameters, and more specifically set the play rate to 0, so that you have a chunk of animation that is holding just one frame of animation for a pose. And we're going to use this technique for both the start section and the end section. So to get started, we'll take a look at case A, which is the hold start section. And this is actually just the most simple case. So all we're really doing is we're duplicating our section, we're sliding it all the way to the left, and we're trimming it from the end. Make sure we are trimming it from the end, and we're setting the play rate to 0, and it should just hold the pose. So inside of Engine, we'll take a look at quickly how to do something like this. So in this example here, we have this offset from frame 15 to frame 36, and we're just going to duplicate this, pressing Control D, and we're just going to slide this over and make sure we're from the end. We're going to trim this down, and we're going to slide it in. Oh, let's say we didn't get good handles there. We're going to do this once more. Slide it in here. And then from here, we're going to change our play rate to 0. Once that's been set, you'll see that although we still have this first loop start frame offset here, we preserve the frame all the way back to the start. So you can see the animation doesn't play until we hit frame 16 here. And what's great about this now is that if we seek and we jump back to here, this is in fact holding the first pose from frame 15 here. So to compare this with our basic setup, if we were scrubbing and then we jump to the beginning, you can see that the pose doesn't actually update. And with this setup that we have now with a duplicated section, we do have an entire frame section that doesn't actually play any animation, but does actually preserve the pose when you jump directly to it. All right, going back to our notes, we have to take a look at 3 different scenarios for the end section. So this can get a little bit complicated, but as we describe each one, you'll see that most of these cases are actually very similar, and you can kind of get away with 1 or 2 rules to sum up all of these calculations. So there's 3 generic cases that we want to cover. So one is you have your animation and it's in a repeating state. So to tell if it's in repeating state, when you drag and extend your section, after a certain duration, you'll see that these dotted lines start showing up and indicating that that's when the animation is starting to loop into the next iteration. So to deal with these kind of cases, we're going to be following these rules here. We're going to duplicate this section. We're going to similarly also set the play rate to 0, and we're going to move it to the end of the current so it matches and lines up right at frame 74 in this example here. And then we're going to use this formula here, which is the duration plus the frame loop offset, subtract 1, and we're going to modulo the animation frame count. So we're going to go through this math in a bit more detail as we do the setup in the example here. So going back into the engine, we're going to open up our next example here with our repeating example. And we're going to duplicate our section in the middle here, pressing Control D. And we're just going to slide it into spot here on frame 74. All right, so now that we have the slide up, we're just going to tidy it up from the end so that matches our play area. And then we're going to set the play rate to 0. So make sure that it's actually not playing at all. You can see that we haven't really calibrated it correctly. So it is in fact popping as we're scrubbing here. So we're going to do some basic math from that formula that we talked about. So looking at our original animation section here, we're going from frame 15 all the way to frame 74. So this is what we're calling the duration. So we have 74 and frame 15. And from our notes, we can see here, our duration is 74 minus 15 is 59 frames. So we have this 59 frames marked for our duration. For the first loop offset, like we showed in the previous examples, we kept 15 as our first loop offset. And our animation frame count is 57. And that's just from our source animation with the run forward animation. So keep in mind we have 59, 15, and 57. So we do some math here. 59 plus 15 minus 1 modulo 57 gives us 16. So if you aren't familiar with the modulo operator, this is actually just the divide and remainder operator. So for example, if any value here that we do in this bracket area is over 57, it's going to give us the remainder of a value that's between 0 and 56. So we're never going to get any value larger than 57. And the reason we do this modulo is just because when we are repeating, we know that we are going for a very, very long range. And we want to make sure that we have an offset that is contextual to our source animation of 57 frames. If we had something like, let's say, 100 frames, that would still technically work, but then you have to kind of do some math in your head, thinking, okay, I got to do 100 minus 57, and that's how many frames offset is my animation. So rather than doing that math and we want to see a consistent frame offset, we're going to do the modulo operator, and here we're going to get 16. So coming back to our level here, if we come back to our clip that we duplicated, we're going to change this to 16 now. And then if we scrub here, you'll see that it doesn't pop. And when we scrub between the last frame and into this new area. And now we have it set up similarly to the start, where we can just jump and the pose will update directly to the last frame of our area here. And it's held for indefinitely for however long you want this frame section to be. All right, so this is a section where we have the repeats, and there's going to be two more sections, two more cases that we need to cover to make sure that we have all the scenarios cut down. So we take a look at B2. This is the case where we have an animation that finishes playing before we get to the end of the section. So you can see here we don't have the dotted line anymore. It's not repeating, but the animation with the 15 frame offset, it's going to end prematurely into this area here. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So we open up this example now. You can see that our animation is playing, and then when it gets to around here, you can see that around right after 57 here, there's no more animation left to play. And only when you are in a range where you are repeating, you can see that as I extend it further, the dotted line shows up. But when you don't have enough frames for it to repeat, you'll see that this animation just stops abruptly here. So in this specific case, the math is actually very, very simple. You don't actually have to calculate any offsets, because at the end of the day, we know that we've actually reached the end of our animation. So the section that we have to define back here is just holding the frame at the last frame of our animation. So if we do something quick here, we would just duplicate it over. We take this, we scale it in. And all we have to do now is come into here, set our play rate to 0. And our offset, we're just going to set to 57 because we know that our animation is 57 frames. So if we take a look at Manny here, we mouse over, you can see that it is 57 frames. And if we set our offset to match our animation clip here, you'll see that we don't get a pop in our animation here because we've just held it with the last pose. And similarly, we can just jump to here and it just holds the pose. All right, so this is a much simpler example where we just duplicate it, set the offset to match the length of our animation, and we're good to go. And in our last example, we're going to show case B3 is the animation doesn't play all the way to the end. So you can see here that we're playing it a bit short. We're going from frame 15 to 40 with a frame offset of 15. And we want to make sure we hold this pose all the way to the end. So similarly, we're going to do the same math that we did in B1, in case B1 here, but we just don't need to do the modulo here because we know that this is going to be a shorter section. And by this definition, it's always going to be less than 57 frames in this section, right? So similarly, we're just going to duplicate the section, move it to the end, set the play rate to 0. And we're going to do the same math, but just without the modulo. So you don't actually even need this animation frame count here, right? So with this offset here, we have inside of engine, we'll take a look at the sample in more detail. So we're starting from frame 15 and we're going all the way to frame 40. So the duration now is 40 minus 15, and that gives us the 25. So we go back here, take a look, 40 minus 15 is the 25. And we haven't changed the first frame offset, so we're going to be using 15 here. And doing the math is going to be 25 plus 15 minus 1 equals to 39. So we're going to punch in 39 as our offset for our duplicate. So we're going to come here, we're going to duplicate it, we're going to scale it out just to fit the range. And then we're going to come down to here, and we're going to change this to 39. And we're going to change our play rate to 0. All right, so with that math, we did some quick napkin math. You can see that from frame 39 to 40, there's no pop in our animation. And now with all of the cases that we covered for B1, 2, and 3, you'll see that we have both the start and end frames, and we can jump directly, and it will be representative of the last pose from the last frame of our animation section. Okay, now if we just iterate again and we take a look at our basic case, we don't have that scenario with our basic setup here. Now, if you're lazy like me and you don't like doing math all the time and having to solve this for every single case, we have an example set up here where we can use our tool, Sequence Baker, that's been released on Fab, to quickly set this up. So you can see here, we can select this animation clip here. We can make sure that we have the playback range matched to our handles here, and we can quickly stub in our areas. So make sure we have this 15 frame offset. You can just click hold before and hold after. And effectively, we've just done the same math that we just talked about throughout this video, but rather than having to do the math in your head or on paper, this is just solved for you automatically. And with our formula here, this works if you're working in different frame rates. So imagine if you were working in like 50 or 60 FPS, and then you threw in a clip that was 30 FPS, this would still calculate it correctly in that context. So we covered the base case where we have animation sequence clips that are matching the same clips, same frame rates as the level sequence. We didn't go into the details of how you can do that for varying frame rates, but this should cover the basics if you are working in the same frame rate for your setup. So I hope this math helps and covers more cases for you guys where you do want to actually hold the pose correctly beforehand and afterwards, and you don't want to have it not be representative of the actual first frame and the last frame. All right, thanks for listening, and see you guys in the next video.